welcome back to Seat Designers. It's Season 4, Episode 87, and I'm here joined by my lovely co-hosts, Frederick Olsen.
Hello.
And Trolls Plymouth.
Hello.
I think it's actually Episode 11, isn't it?
It should be, yes.
It should be, yeah. We've been recording these out of order, which hasn't been particularly helpful.
I've learned when I shouldn't say anything, and this is definitely one of the places. So I'm not saying anything.
Yes, Fred will now remain silent for the rest of the episode. We've done an old switch. Gareth will be doing most of the talking, and Fred will be quiet. So it's a breath of fresh air already.
Yeah. We can always mute him; it'll be fine. Yes, well, I'm hosting this week because we're actually talking about something that I might slightly know something about, which is history, the one thing that I actually spend any time doing. Nothing about computer games, obviously, just the history bit. Because we have a real-life other Ph.D. who outranks me on the basis of being an assistant professor. It's Laine Nooney. How are you doing, Laine?
I'm all right. How are you guys?
Pretty good, thank you.
So excellent. And clean. I took a shower for this.
So very academic.
Yes, I feel very academic. I'm even wearing a bathrobe, which I hear is very fancy in academic circles.
I'm a bit ill, I came down with the same kind of cold 2 times in a row. So, I'm feeling very epidemic. It's almost the same thing.
Epidemic and academic. Ah, the puns. The puns.
It's his second language,
Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So anyway, we've got Laine on because Laine has done quite a lot of work with the history of games, and I was reading one of her articles earlier that I really want to get into. But before I do, Laine, would you like to introduce yourself and explain who you are?
Sure thing. So Laine Nooney. I'm an assistant professor of digital media in the School of Literature, Media, and Communication at Georgia Tech. This is the same program as another somewhat famed game studies guy named Ian Bogust, or Janet Murray, for those of you who are fans of the history of narrative in games. And I have been working in game history. I would say I identify as a computer and video game historian, as well as a media studies scholar, and I've been working in this area kind of since I began my my real dissertation work in earnest. So I've been doing this not that long, all things considered. Probably I started working in this area around 2011, 2012. Yeah.
And I have to say, well, first of all, I have to say sorry for speaking out of turn. I know that's frowned upon in academic circles. And
on this show.
You can stop with those jokes at any point. It's, we do live in the 21st century, those of us with doctorates.
No. I refute that.
Okay. I also like how that was very, I won't say passive aggressive. It was just like, will you shut the fuck up, please, sir?
At least somebody's telling you.
That's what I need to learn to do rather than shut you down aggressively. That's the tone of voice I need.
Yeah, exactly.
That is the well-practiced tone of someone who's taught undergraduates for a very long time.
There's a lot of patience involved, yes, and I am an undergraduate.
I sympathize.
So this is what my advisor was on about when he just said, "Now get out of my office, please." The second thing I wanted to say was your Skype avatar has you sort of grabbing the lapels of your jacket in a sort of "come at me, bro" kind of fashion. Could you just please briefly explain that to us before we get into the
that was simply a outtake of a photo shoot I did for some headshots. If you could see the full body portrait, I'm actually just kind of putting on a jacket, but I did have an ex who said it made me look like I was trapped in my own coat, and so she has been waiting for me to change that avatar, and I just, Skype isn't high on my list of social media, so I haven't gotten around to it, but I probably will now after we've outed this fact publicly.
I'm gonna have to
after
take a screenshot.
After this show, Skype will be even lower on your list of social media.
Right.
Anyway, Gareth, what's the main topic?
Well, what I was fascinated with on your article from, I think it was 2014, was the stuff about women in video gaming, which was fantastic on a number of levels, and we'll probably get into that. But the thing that really caught my eye was that you seem to be consciously trying to move well, not just you, but obviously the field in general, consciously trying to move the history of video games away from just writing down the list of shit that happened in chronological order and moving towards trying to give it some kind of cultural kind of context. So I wondered if you could just say a little bit about that before we kind of get into it.
Absolutely. I mean, that's, I think, a pretty good summary of what myself and a lot of my colleagues kind of across the globe are up to. One of the things I say is that history in many, many disciplines tends to take a certain cyclical fashion where the first people who are interested in it and who write stuff about it are enthusiasts, people who worked in that industry. It tends to be very fact-based. It tends to rely a lot on first-person experiences. And that has been particularly true in the history of games where, if you look at a lot of the if you were to look at books that you pull up on Amazon, a lot of what they're interested in doing is kind of chronicling events and explaining, how some company became famous or how some particular game got made. And I think my position is that any history that can only kind of stare at itself is not a very interesting or useful history in my terms, anyway.
So is that one of those if you don't learn from history, you're doomed to repeat it kind of thing? If you only write about now I'm getting my wires crossed here.
Have you ever had a dreams?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the question and the answer was on such a high level that I completely blanked out and just started staring at my Facebook page. No, I'm just kidding. Could you explain that for the laypersons in the room? That would be me and Fred.
The history of games is wrapped up in so many other kinds of history, and yet the only way we tend to write about the history of games as if they exist in the center of the world, right? This is where, when you talk to historians, you get into a difference between kind of history and historiography. And so historiography is kind of talking about the science of how stuff gets written. Right? It's how have all these other people written about this object or this cultural phenomena, and then what kind of shape does that give to us, or what kind of impression does it give to us about what the history of this thing is? Right. And the fact is that you can begin to change using different kinds of methods or different kinds of techniques, looking at objects through different kinds of lenses. You can begin to shift what that historiography is. That's what historians do, right? We try to say, well, what does this kind of history exclude? What can't it account for? And then how can I find a way to actually bring those other kinds of voices or perspectives or politics into the historical account that I want to provide?
Okay, so it's a contextualizing issue where you're doing most game history apparently just tends to focus on the game history itself, and then you try to sort of wrap it into a larger context of what else was going on in the world.
I mean, the history of games is also, it's a history of labor, it's an economic history, it's a history of kind of the expansion of digital technology across the globe. It's, a technological history. It's, so one of the ways I deal with this in the history of Sierra Online is I do, really, really extensive oral history with people who did not hold top level management or creative positions at the company. So I tracked down people who worked in public relations, and I tracked down people who worked in the factory floor. And what I try to do out of that is sculpt a sense of actually a labor history and what other historians would call a social history, right? Like, what was the kind of work that people did that actually allowed the game industry to survive? How do we decenter the idea that game history is just all about designers or all about people who owned or founded the company, right? These kind of mythologies that we want to draw up around them. There's so much more to say about games than the things we have said, and yet all we seem to do is kind of repeat the same set of stories kind of over and over and over again.
Right.
So part of my work is how can we, if we start expecting a little more and looking at these things through different lenses, how can we get to histories that might include stuff that in other ways we never would have thought was actually a part of the history of games, but it turns out it is.
Well, this is
sort of
people will keep publishing the mainstream history, about Sierra Online, about Ken and Roberta, and some of the really famous designers, two guys from Andromeda, Lowe, Jim Walls. These people were rock stars, and their stories are still, their histories are still widely spoken of today.
Well, I mean,
I definitely get the idea of that.
Well, my particular feels like the history of medicine, and what you've just described, Laine, is pretty much the history of medicine in the 1940s. It was a story of great white men that went out and cured great diseases, and the interesting thing was how they found their cures, how they'd grown up and loved science and all this other kind of stuff. And then it wasn't until sort of the 50s and 60s that you start to get people going, yeah, but what about nurses? What about patients?
Yes.
What about the ways in which medicine means more than just the science? And you seem to be cutting a few corners here. Aren't you supposed to be doing this for another 20, 30 years before you get onto the interesting stuff?
I would say that as a proper Foucauldian, my response is absolutely not. That I think in a lot of ways there's a granularity to my work where I am producing a tremendous amount of information that isn't just about kind of restructuring, or how do I want to put it? I would say I'm doing a lot of both. I am in many ways producing a lot of historical information that is like outrightly new, while at the same time asking really demanding questions about like how do we talk about or construct sometimes I put this as, what do we think the object of video game history is? And depending on your answer to that, it tells me a lot about like how history winds up getting constructed. But, to your point, Gareth, this is the same thing we see in the history of computing, right? That for decades, the history of computing was about Alan Turing and Charles Babbage and all of these, famous white guys from Europe who worked on early computing machines. And it was, the 60s are an important moment because this is when social history kind of arrives to the academy and people start saying, well, what about everyone else in the supply chain, right? What are the contributions of these people? How do we understand them as relevant to historical progress or innovation? And this is where now you get, we just, last year released the film Hidden Figures, right? Or I think that was in January, right? About the contributions of African-American women to NASA, right? That's not a history you can actually get if all you're doing is looking at the small group of men at the top of the organizational chart who we attribute with making the decisions about the history of computing or science.
It's kind of a relief that the days of that skewed perspective, those days aren't gone, unfortunately. But I mean, it's getting harder. More and more people have the opportunity to read about someone like Grace Hopper, who was the woman behind COBOL, which was probably the most widely applied programming language for a long while, and lots of banking systems and finance systems and those kind of systems have a heart of COBOL running underneath. It has the reputation of being a crap language, but she introduced something that literally made the computing world of this 70s, 80s, 90s maybe tick, and that totally. Story is getting out there now thanks to social media in part.
Well, that's actually one of the interesting things about the article I was reading, Laine, because you were saying that what's quite interesting about Roberta Williams isn't necessarily what she did, which of course is interesting, but what's even more pertinent is the way that Roberta Williams' history has been used by the industry to give it some kind of legitimacy. That was one of the great things from that.
Yeah, so in that article, you're catching me doing some real kind of game historical insider baseball, right? So that is very much a piece written for other historians, right?
That's probably why I liked it.
And so it's not exactly maybe the most accessible or obvious piece for someone who isn't interested in arguments about historiography. But the way I would sort of explain this is that I think we learn more by looking at what we need her to be in the historical record than whatever it is that she actually did. And she becomes a kind of, I would say, kind of a prop or a device. I think Grace Hopper falls into this category too. So does Ada Lovelace. These are also the names of kind of women in technology that I name check in that article. That, Roberta Williams, it's kind of funny. When I started this dissertation, when I started writing about her, or thinking I was going to write about her, I was like, oh, wow, this lost woman from the history of games, right? I thought I was going to like bring to life this figure. And when I really got into it, I was like, everybody and their goddamn brother knows who this woman is, right? This is absolutely, there's no mystery here, right? We're actually talking about the single most commonly referenced woman in the history of video games.
Yeah.
So like, there's no excavation story to tell, but we seem to have such a limited number of things to say about her. A lot of them aren't really thoroughly researched or, very much interrogated beyond a very, very kind of narrow, I would say, surface interest. And so that became the interest. It was like, why do we actually have so little to say about this woman who really makes no sense at all in the history of this industry? Like there is no, she is in contrast to what is such a incredible pattern of how people get interested in computing or gaming, how they get access to these kinds of machines, how she navigated both her kind of public persona while Sierra was in existence and the choices she has made about whether or not to speak to the public afterwards. Like, she is a total anomaly, and yet all I've seen other writers in game history try to do is tell this very kind of repetitive, almost predictable sort of story about her that I feel like doesn't really get into like why she is so fascinating. And so what I wanted to do in that article was kind of make transparent the way in which we've already set up the terms on which we think we understand her. And for me, like, the kind of interrogation I think we can do that can really begin to dismantle some of those easy presumptions.
Yeah, because most of the stuff that I've read about Roberta Williams always start out in the same way. She and Ken founded the company, and she wasn't a computer programmer. She just wanted to tell a good story, and blah blah blah. Ken coded it up, sold it in Ziploc bags. There you go. Which is the only sort of narrative framing that will equate to how you normally, if like developer X started out writing basic programs and then became a successful programmer, and then we've heard these stories on the show when we've had developers in, and all the stories pretty much start the same way. I started in computer sciences, and then turns out I was good at it, and then I started my own company. And Roberta's story is so fundamentally different. It's just she doesn't fit into the pattern of someone who would end up co-running a multi-million-dollar software company. So I see where you're coming from. It's not just the standard woman in gaming slap-on tag, which is levited a lot against her, obviously. But also the way she doesn't fit into a story about the developer as such, because she wasn't.
Yeah. But what's very interesting about her is that Sierra's entire kind of capacity or imagination to develop a system of game development that separates the designer from the programmer is completely instantiated in her. Right? Like the idea, it kind of begins with her, this notion that these could be separate roles, which was not a way that game development really worked during that time period.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Well, that's true. You've oftentimes you had games that were developed by one person, like the titular adventure, I believe. That's like one person coding something into a mainframe. Like John Romero told us, that's what you would do. You would write text adventures and you would code them into a mainframe, and you would waste your company's paper and get fired.
But a lot of the stories is also about the computer auteur. You've got your Jordan Mechner's and the person who did Another World. I can't remember his name. Sorry. What was that?
Another person, basically.
Yeah, another person. It's usually, the one person who sits down and has this creative vision and then, plonks it out pretty much all on his own. And I'm underlining his because that's usually the story that's told as well. And the idea of having, the group separate, you've got the game designer over here with the vision who doesn't know how to code a single line of code and, passes the vision on and communicates it and such. Yeah, that was just really a statement more than a question, actually.
No, but that's one of the things that makes Roberta interesting. And again, just to go back to the one thing of yours that I've read. Sorry, Laine.
We should probably link to the article.
Oh, we'll definitely link to the article.
Lest it just be the mysterious article.
I would just like to say I've read more than just one article, but it was a long time ago, and it was basically the history of Infocom and some of the Sierra memories and such, and they're all very interesting. But yeah. So, sorry, there was a question forming, and I was just interrupting because I'm an asshole like that.
All available on backseatdesigners.com. No, one of the I think what needs to be said, and I don't mean this in a pejorative at all. I think it helps to explain some of the things that are going on. Is that she's Ken's wife, and it's that domesticity to her having the sort of the table where she comes up with the idea for this game. Obviously, being married to Ken gives her access to some of the stuff that maybe she wouldn't have had. You talk about that love letter to Sierra, where this female fan of Sierra kind of writes in and sort of explains why she fell in love with the writing and the sort of the storytelling that Roberta did, and that the fact that she is so queer compared to everything else that's going on in the industry at that time, I think is rather fascinating. I mean, we have, and I'm afraid to say this, we can sometimes be a little bit dismissive of Roberta Williams on this show and the quality of the writing in King's Quest. But there's absolutely no doubt.
That's mainly the story. I'm not. By any means, I am not contesting that King's Quest was a groundbreaking game series. New ground was broken, and now I'm realizing that new ground was also broken in how they were made, because I'd never even lent much credence to this thought, but it's absolutely true. She was not a video game auteur. She was a video game writer and designer for the first time ever. It's just that for me, the stories don't cut it. But I mean, I'm only turning 29 in a couple of weeks. I'm a young'un, I didn't. That sense of wonder never really arrived for obvious reasons, because I was somewhere else in terms of video game history when I first discovered King's Quest. Yeah,
I think it's really underregarded. The extent to which what was so fascinating about these games, what was so exciting, the reason that a game like Mystery House, which is basically just like a fucked up stick figure looking game that doesn't make any sense, right? I mean, that game is like just like deeply narratively confusing, right? It wanders all over the place. I mean, it's kind of a mess of a game to get your head around. You have to realize the reason that people went wild for this stuff was because no one had ever seen a computer do that before.
No, it was brand new.
That was the most transformative quality of these games. And when you were able to take Sir Graham, as he was in King's Quest, the first King's Quest, not yet a king, and walk him around a tree. What I have referred to that as is that was the technological mic drop of 1983. Like, no one knew how to do that. And so you were kind of watching magic be performed on these screens every single time, right? Like, there was a thrill just in moving him behind a thing and watching him come out the other side. And I think that it's the kind of context you need to understand the delirium that I would imagine that would produce, right? I mean, it's like seeing cinema for the first time.
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Mm-hmm. I think one thing we should probably lay to rest on this show is that we do give Roberta a lot of shit, and there are two reasons for that. One is, of course, the with hindsight, in modern hindsight, some of the design choices and some of the puzzles and the pie to the Yeti face and all that is laughable today, but it comes in a historical retrospective, it comes out of there was no handbook, there was no manual for this. All she had were inspirations that just basically came out of the blue. She even says she wasn't really a game player all that much. Yeah. So this was just stuff she put in because it instinctively felt like something she had to put in. What I wanted to say was, there's a clear difference between, the shit that we give Roberta in a ha-ha sort of way, the stereotype that she's a, computer game sadist who likes to put players through hell, and then there's the legend of Roberta, and the legend could literally have been anyone. It just so happened that it was her who did it first, which was to, actively, just imagine something, not sit down at a computer and work out how do I actually do this. She just thought of it and was able to convince someone to sit down and no, it has to be like this, it has to go like that. And there was so she had the vision.
It's sort of funny because try to compare her story to that of Scott Murphy. As far as I know, and Scott has probably told all of us that he learned, he was primarily a guy who wanted to write, but he went in and learned programming to make the games he wanted to make. So he's an autodidact and worked on King's Quest 2 and probably some of the other titles as well. But he taught himself how to do that. Roberta didn't. So, you have a guy here who winds up being the auteur that we talk about, but still quite a different story.
Yeah, I mean, and it's interesting to me that if she had wanted to learn, she could have, right? All the resources were there, and she elected not to. And that kind of tells me something about her set of interests, right? And the way in which she kind of imagined that she wanted to be involved or responsible for the making of these games. There was a certain position she felt sort of like comfortable or wanted to work in. I mean, I've read very early interviews with her in which she's made statements like that she would like to program so that she could participate more in the creation of the game. And it's hard to know necessarily like why that didn't pan out, especially given that the entire purpose, or maybe not the entire purpose, but one of the side results of the development of the AGI engine is the simplification of programming to a series of almost kind of, I'm not going to say routinized performance, but the idea was that you're giving someone a tool with which they can just kind of produce simple iterations of rooms and objects.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. This is my exact experience. Growing up, I played games and I wanted to make games, and I was absolutely shit at programming, and I still am. And every time I sat down and tried to learn it, the obstacles just kept piling up. It just became more and more, okay, I can't actually do this thing that I have in my mind because I can't figure out how to practically do it. And then it's not until, many, many years later, 30 years down the line, Adventure Game Studio comes out, and suddenly a complete Luddite like me can actually sit down and, craft a tale. And now, of course, I have the second hurdle, which is that I can't draw for shit. So now I have to get over that. But
so, in 30 additional years,
in 30 years,
come along that allows you to.
Adventure games were never meant to be made by one person after 1983. Like I just. Those engines are literally designed to be kind of a factory floor.
They're an assembly.
They're designed for multiple people to contribute simplified tasks to create a larger whole.
Yeah.
It's kind of built into the software.
It's because it's not like sitting down to write a book or write a music album or anything where you could feasibly do all of it yourself. With game development, there are so many talents that goes into it. Yeah. You've got the writing, you've got the design, you've also got the programming and the graphics and the music, and everything has to come together to a cohesive whole that won't make people go, "What is this, amateur hour?" So I totally see what you mean. However, I will also say that some people do possess all of these qualities and can sit down on their own lonesome in Adventure Game Studio and knock this out, because now we've reached the high level of programming necessity where it's not even programming, it's scripting now. So, we've got you got the whole AGS community knocking out games over, a period of 2 weeks. I mean,
sure.
We've even done that. Can I with everyone's permission, kind of broaden the scope a bit?
You go ahead, Trolls. You've deserved it. You've deserved a cookie. Go ahead.
Thank you.
Broaden our scopes.
Oh, thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to, and here comes the vocabulary failure. I just wanted to talk about gaming history in general, because it's been very much the Roberta Williams Appreciation Society up until now.
Which
not
is the first time we've ever done this on the show.
And it will never happen again.
not that there's anything wrong with that. I mean, we can all agree that Roberta Williams, the legend, is important and, a worthwhile topic to cover. And we can still give her shit in the haha locker room kind of way. Sorry, I shouldn't have said locker room. That has a Trumpish kind of feel to it.
Yeah, I was going to say that might be a little libel in that one.
Yeah. It was an innocent phrase 10 years ago. No, sorry. Back on track. What I wanted to do was broaden the scope a bit and talk about game history in general, because game history, up until we started this conversation, actually, in my mind, it was one of those kind of I wouldn't say fleeting, but kind of those. Why do we even need game history? Quotation marks in the sense that I got the sense that most historians would look at someone who identified as a video game historian and go, right, well, so when are you going to get a real job kind of way? So why is game history important, Laine?
What an odd question. I mean, I would rather like to hear the argument for why it isn't. To me, it's so self-evident, I guess.
It's a complete devil's advocate. It's a complete devil's advocate question. I think
the counter argument is, of course, easy, because what we all appreciate is that games are so culturally and aesthetically important to all of us, and the kind of storytelling that you get in games is so important that there is no way around this. We have to archive this. We have to document it. I'm sure there are certain people out there who would go, video games are just for young people who slack off, can't figure out how to do jack shit, blah, blah. Video games make people violent.
Maybe I can express some of my historical prejudices then, and maybe use this as a sort of a potential example. I don't know if the same is true on your side of the pond, but over here, military historians have a certain reputation for being a bit dull and rather humorless and not being particularly interesting. And it tends to be,
really?
although there do tend to be professional military historians, it's also done by a lot of amateurs. And what the amateurs are interested in is the precise movement of troops. They're interested in the quality of the uniforms. They're interested in the names of the battalions. They're interested in the generals. They're interested in this.
These are the people who watch the History Channel for like 24 hours a day.
Yeah, and not porn stars either. The really kind of dry stuff. And I think if you think that gaming history is, as Laine kind of described, that old style narrative Whiggish history of one fucking thing after another leading to a progression from bad games to good games, and you don't really see that there's a cultural context for that, and you don't see that there are other things going on beyond the headline software and hardware, I can completely understand why you think it's a complete waste of time, in the same way that I think not a complete waste of time knowing what Napoleon did at the Battle of Waterloo, but to be honest, I'm more interested about the Irish people who are starving at the time that the Waterloo battle is happening. That's what interests me, and I would say that what Laine is doing is really important, and while that chronicling stuff is important because we need somebody to do it, that's the bit that I don't necessarily think holds the same epistemic weight, let's say.
Ooh,
that's a good one.
What?
No, I want to make it clear that I think it is very important, and I don't
think anyone here thinks it isn't. So let me think. Let me explain it this way.
I think the epistula mate is very, very important.
So, let me explain this in terms of my own profession, right? And so think of me first. I just gave a talk at GDC, the Game Developers Conference, out in San Francisco 2 weeks ago, called Save Yourself, Game History is in Your Hands, which was sort of about trying to come to the game industry and explain certain things to them about what history is. And one of the first things I tried to articulate is that, perhaps getting to some of what Gareth is distinguishing here is that to be a historian is to be in a profession in which I am interested in talking, in some sense, foremost to other historians, right? Like that's my profession, in the same way that people in the game industry want to come together and talk to other people in the game industry. Mm-hmm. And this again may be just really insider baseball, but I make the most sense I could never get hired in a history department. Let me put it that way.
Well, I'm trying.
Because I am not trained, quote unquote, as someone who studies history kind of in the way that you're talking about, Gareth. Okay. Right? So in the US context, I make sense as a media studies person. And so media studies is this, we've got everything from, historians of cinema and radio to computing and video games. And so in that context, right, people who are interested in the study and impact of communication technology and in digital technology, video games makes total sense, right? It's kind of the latest iteration of X, which isn't to say that people sometimes think they're really dumb, or that games aren't really dumb. I have to go on the job market and kind of defend why games are interesting. And one of the things I say is that this is a definitive medium of the 21st century.
Yay!
That every quality that we see have a part in some other medium condenses in games. So games are, not only do they deal with issues of representation, but they also deal with problems of interaction design. They also have to do with they're intimately connected to the development of kind of the threshold of computer technology over the late 20th and into the 21st century. Their supply chains tell you everything you need to know about kind of the broader issues surrounding the supply chains in the computing industry, from kind of the mining of rare earth metals to the problems of e-waste that you get in the kind of dig in Alamogordo. Like for me, I study games as a historian because I think games allow us a way to talk about our biggest historical problems. So maybe the best way, and if we could cut out that earlier part, the best way to put this is that I don't study games through a historical lens so that I can know more facts about the history of games. I come to games because I think that they allow us to wrangle with our biggest historical questions, right? What is the nature of historical evidence? Can you be a historian of the present? What kinds of tools and techniques do we need to produce a history of an industry that has left almost its only viable record in its end product, right? That's a huge fucking historical problem.
Yay! Right? And she swears too. I love everything that you're saying right now.
And so that's why I do this work, because I think that really interesting problems coagulate around games, and that gets me excited as a historian, right? So the kind of work that I can do with a case study like Sierra is kind of unparalleled in many other industries, right? And there's, video games they're kind of one part entertainment industry, they're one part technology industry, which means they deal with both of those problems kind of simultaneously and in really unique ways. I think that they're, I don't get into a lot of hype, but yeah, I think they're really confusing objects, and I think the fact that we attach so much nostalgia to them in a way that I think is different from how we talk about any other medium is itself reflective of a kind of it tells us something about our historical condition, is maybe the way I would frame it, right? Like, what's our historical psychology as a kind of modern species, right? Like, why do we look at these things and obsess about them in this particular way, right? We don't really do that in the same way with other kinds of media, right? But what is it about games? Go ahead. Sorry. Shut me up at any point.
No, definitely. I want to keep you rolling. I just want to latch on to one thing that you said, which was that can you be a history of the contemporary, something that's going on right now? And if I may venture a comparison, and please feel free to disagree, it sounds a lot like the people who wrote letters and such in Pompeii. They're like, oh, now the volcano is erupting and such. Like they were recording history as it was happening, and decades from now, people will look back on the writings of Laine Nooney and going, oh, so that's what the fuck was going on back then, and try to contextualize that. Does that make any sense whatsoever?
So that, Trolls, is historiography.
Yay!
Yes. Yes, it is.
I flunked history in high school, by the way, so I'm really catching up.
You did?
I was terrible at it.
Wow. I wouldn't have thought so.
Do the Danes really have history, though? Is that the problem?
Yeah, there's that.
Oh, the Danes. Yeah.
Oh, there is,
right?
Yeah.
There is currently a lot of, and this is actually interesting. It's nothing to do with the subject, but currently there is a lot in the media about how it's this year, 100 years ago, that we sold back all of our colonies to the United States, and we were a slave nation. And we were pretty hard ass at that. And for decades and decades and decades, there has been this is slightly relevant. There has been this narrative that Denmark were among the first to drop slaving, and we were probably doing that for humanist reason. It turns out no, we weren't that early with getting rid of slavery. B, no, it was more of a business point because too many slaves were dying and we lost money. It has nothing to do with humanism. And, there you kind of have it again, that as I would say lesser intelligent people like me would say history is written by the winners. And I think as a nation, it's causing us a shitload of problems that this myth has been perpetuated.
Well, and I completely agree with that. I mean, I consider myself a bit of a contemporary historian, partially because I do the post-war history, and partially because I have done some work on the history of the internet. But that thing about history being written by the winners was something that I kind of wanted to get into with the history of video games, because the winners are people with green frogs as their avatars, and they are absolutely adamant that the history of video games remains just the history of shit that happened. There's something actually quite radical about saying, actually, it's more complicated than that, that everything that we do is rooted in the way that society is, and that these games don't just exist out of their own bubble, that there is more to that. So it's that's definitely a good way of looking at it, and that slave example from Denmark, I think, illustrates that perfectly.
Yeah,
wow, we did something.
Ooh, well, apparently the problem is we were, but I'm very, very glad we've stopped.
Jesus. Yeah, go ahead, Laine.
Grim. To one way that I talk about that in the context of video games is that, I would say that this is endemic of the game industry itself, right? Is that it doesn't know how to talk about people who didn't make video games their entire lives. And so I think this is one of the interesting things that kind of comes up around Roberta, but this is also one of the things that my favorite thing is to find people in the historical record who were like in the industry for a couple years and then like left or like totally failed. And then we've never, like, the game industry, I think, really needs to believe it's so much of its labor politics is kind of rooted in this idea that games are this like lifetime commitment, right? That you can never welch on. That I think there's actually something really like powerful in showing examples where actually no, like lots and lots and lots of people in this industry were in it for a hot minute and then left or failed or couldn't pull it off. And actually, like, those stories that do not end in the acclaim of the industry tell us a lot more about the industry, right? In the same way where sometimes I'll tell people in the industry that, like, the things that you don't talk about are what historians are going to pay attention to. So, like, save all the games you want, bro. It's actually not, like, when the historians come back around in 100 years, and I guarantee they are the only people who are going to give a shit about the stuff that you were making, like, it's not going to be just what you saved that we're interested in, right? It's going to be the thing that you couldn't seem to talk about, or the thing that, like, we didn't know how to speak to, right? I mean, this is...
or why the fuck you would wear a fedora and a neck beaters?
No, seriously, it'll be the
politics of absence, right? Are as relevant to there's certainly stuff that to get back to some of what Trolls was bringing up. That's a tactic used a lot in having to write things like the history of slavery, right? Which is a history that where those bodies have. Right, they did not have a capacity to leave their own history behind, right? And that's a tactic. It's like a it's like it's a weapon of the weak, right? It's something that we can turn to deconstruct or to make a problem out of the mainstream narrative that people want to hand us.
Yeah, because it's kind of like if to reuse the Pompeii example is that those people were fossilized in ash, so we can go back and poke and prod at them and learn things from them. But
yep, that's
but
how
no
it
one's. Yeah, exactly. And then they just fall to the ground, flop, and you go, oh, I should get better at this. But no one has fossilized any, computer tapes, and you hear stories of game companies that have folded, and the programmers and artists kind of save what they can, old drawings and computer disks and hard drives and such. But and then they just end up in attics somewhere. And a historian has to come in and sort of dig that out. It's I'm sort of reminded, and this is kind of tangential, but I'm reminded of when my favorite movie Blade Runner got the special edition 25th anniversary, whatever the fuck it was. It came out
the 25th special edition because it has a ton of cuts.
Yeah, and now the thing was they had to go to people's attics in Switzerland and get VHS tapes of scenes that were cut out and deleted, and had to sort of clean those up and put them back in the movie. And it was like a worldwide hunt for the stuff that used to be in the movie but now suddenly had vanished into thin air. And if we're not careful in preserving not just the things that went to market, got sold on Steam and got great reviews and such, but also the shit that just got left. And never really made it anywhere. If that stuff gets lost, then an important chapter of the history of video games get lost.
And this is why archives are so important. And why archivists are so important as well. Because this is the problem with the history of the internet. We've had bots crawling the internet for 20, 25 years now, and they've been doing a reasonably good job of picking up information. But nobody's curated it. Nobody's gone through and worked out what's actually worth keeping. So if you try and do any history with the Internet Archive, it's fucking impossible.
Thank you, Gareth. This is like a statement of sanity, right? There's this.
It's rare for him.
Yeah, I'm taking that. We're putting that on the soundboard, guys.
So, part of the talk I gave at GDC was about the fact that we have deluded ourselves into thinking that the Internet Archive is like a sustainable solution for the problem of history, right? Which is not to say that, I love Jason Scott. I've been to his house. We're buddies. I think the Internet Archive is a phenomenal project. I think it is like one tactical application. But it does not necessarily have at its core a historical mandate. It's metadata is a fucking mess. It's really hard to, it's not the easiest thing in the world to search. You kind of have to know what you're looking for. And the Wayback Machine can be very hit or miss. It still doesn't capture all the links. There's endlessly, I think we've kind of imbibed this idea that just because it's digital, it's permanent.
Oh, no,
it can always exist, and it's no, this crap is endlessly impossible to find.
It's like going to the library and looking through the microfiche of old newspapers. That's exactly, because I had to do that for one of my university projects, and we would just sit there for hours and hours scrolling through these we got tunnel vision at the end of it, and we were just going, what the fuck? What are we even looking for? Does anyone remember our names? What is going on?
And then you realize you've turned it upside down.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Actually, no, honest to God, that happened.
It's actually worse than that, Trolls, because at least somebody has taken the time to work out what needs to be put on microfiche. The British Library has developed a search engine. It's one of the things that I worked on very sort of tangentially a few years ago, and it's actually worse than nothing in some ways. In some ways, it's very good, but in other ways, it's worse than nothing because we're conditioned, or at least I'm conditioned, because I'm not, I'm techie, but not. Not a computer scientist by any stretch of the imagination. Google has ruined me. I thought I could just put in some kind of search term into the Internet Archive, into this search engine that the British Library has developed, and I'd be able to find useful websites and things that were useful. No, it's actually even worse, because you just get, you put in something like disability benefit, and then you get loads of results of adverts for disability benefits, which are completely and utterly useless, that clog everything up. We're going off on a tangent here, but
Well, I mean, it's relevant to the subject. I mean, there is a lot of web pollution, and as someone who has, I just have an AP degree in computer science, so I am that much of a computer scientist, even though I am a computer scientist. But one potential problem that interests me, which I'm guessing you've also touched upon in your research, Laine, is that we can't be absolutely sure we'll be able to access this stuff tangentially in the future. I mean, programming languages die out, CPUs become faster. We're talking about quantum computing now. Will we be able to access this stuff in the future? I think is very relevant. And I think we take for granted that the digital medium is kind of more solid, it's a more concrete medium.
It is immortal somehow.
You can make a copy of a copy of a copy and things will still exist, but it's also really fickle because it's so dependent on media that are inherently flawed.
It's a good Nine Inch Nails song, though.
Yeah. I think you're so one anecdote I was thinking when both you and Trolls and Gareth were speaking is that I was joking around with one of my other colleagues who's a historian of, he writes about the history of BBS boards and Minitel and things like that. And we were both talking about, both of us use pretty extensively Google scans of InfoWorld issues from the 1980s. I don't know if you're aware of this, but InfoWorld magazine has been kind of scanned and uploaded to Google Books, but you can't download any of it. Which means okay, so I can do, and if you kind of learn how to work within the way that InfoWorld thinks about knowledge, right? But we were both talking about how when we find a link to a page, what we have to do is take a screen cap of it and then put it into our archive, right? So I have this really extensive Evernote database. I will do a print screen of a page of Google because we also operate under this fear that if we don't take that screen cap right then, who knows if we will ever be able to find that page again?
True. The other part of that is that, of course, that the data is malleable. A website. Yeah. I mean, this is one thing that our Internet Archive sort of does, but again, it's a fucking drag to actually get it up. But a web page will change over time. A history book doesn't change unless a new edition is printed. So you can always go back to the previous edition unless it burned in a fire or something.
And that's
the Internet doesn't do that.
Yeah, and so. I this point of how we, after I gave this talk at GDC, a lot of the first questions that people wanted to ask me were, had to do with the fact that I think, especially the younger generation, a lot of them grew up in these kind of persistent online worlds, and they don't understand how these things exist as historical documents. And they were asking me questions like, how do I preserve, this time that I spent, even stuff that's even more niche than the kind of obvious Second Life or World of Warcraft. And I'm like, girl, I don't know. Like that is such a problem. I can't even begin to figure out, let alone, to Troll's point of how do we just getting stuff that's on DOS, right? To work consistently, to not have to go through 3,000 levels of to not have to rebuild our emulator every time Internet Explorer updates or whatever the fuck, This is one of the reasons why I think I have kind of taken a turn in my work. It's not to say that I don't write about the games, but I think when my book comes out, there's going to be a lot less about the games than people might like. Is that I'm kind of into the idea of decentering the game from game history, because I think, one, the game is such a volatile problem. I think you're right that it's not necessarily sustainable into the long-term future as something we're going to be able to access. And so I'm interested in more pliant and I think kind of culturally specific modes. So this is why I do a lot of oral history, right? Because oral history produces a contextually specific but stable account, and you can do a lot of stuff with an oral history, right? There's lots of ways of thinking about, not only does it provide you with some kind of references about, the order of events and when things happen and what people's perspective was, but oral history is also very much about getting comfortable with the things that we're never going to be able to find and can't remember, right? When you start having to sit down with people and the idea that oral history or that talking to someone who made a game is ever a source or like truth becomes really complicated immediately.
Oh yeah, because the fallibility of memory and all that.
And all sorts of other stuff, right? And often what I do is I will read an oral history conversation that I have with someone more for what they forget than for what they remember.
Yeah, exactly.
And so you can do. I find I'm more interested in that process. I write about the games, but to me, I think we already have to begin as historians to think about other tactics. For getting to what's big and interesting and valuable about the history of games. And so in some ways, I think I'm kind of unique in the way that I bracket or kind of put to the side the game itself so that I can focus on all of this other stuff. And I guess those are other people's questions to solve,
No, but I think that's very interesting, because I read recently that the last survivors of the Danish resistance in the 1940s are now dying out. So it was kind of those, if you have a question, you should probably start asking it now.
Because some of them are currently unable to answer. We just they may be technically alive, but we just wanted to bring that up.
One last thing I wanted to bring up, which you kind of already did bring up, was how are we even going to be able to play these games 50 years in the future? It does. Now that you've gone down this route, I actually think it's more interesting to talk about because game development is such a closeted kind of thing. At least it used to be before Kickstarter and such. But back in the 90s, if you were making a game, you shut the door and you stayed inside, and PR will handle all the external communication, and it'll come out in like Interaction magazine, which is just like a glossy PR rag. and no one, I mean, game developers are very reticent to sit down and talk about, this game was actually a bitch to make. You look at we've done interviews now with John Romero and Tom Hall of id Software, and id Software's history is infamous for there were clashes back and forth, and Tom Hall pissed off during the development of Doom because they didn't want to use the story for the game and all of this stuff. And it's kind of hard to coax out these sort of, these are not heartwarming tales of, buddies getting together making a game. It's just like, I don't really want to talk about that anymore.
But to a certain extent, Trolls, I mean, it does serve their purposes for building their myth of being a punk rock kind of out there indie developer.
Well, yeah, but there's a difference between the image they want to portray and what it was actually like in the trenches. And I think what Laine does very, very astutely and importantly is to, dig into the trenches and sort of. So have you ever sat down with a bottle of scotch and just lied to them and said, "Oh, the tape recorder's off. You can say anything"?
No, I do practice a certain kind of historical ethics, although there have been. Maybe not bottles of scotch, but there was a really good interview I did up in Seattle that involved a couple bottles of champagne.
Nice.
That was definitely a blast.
We've had bottles of scotch on this show, and I wish the recorder wasn't running at that time, but it was.
That's usually highly frowned upon by most historians, let me say.
Yeah, I would imagine.
That's not exactly.
There's also the issue of defamation. I mean, you don't want to badmouth someone who's still alive. So because they are still in the industry, they'll go off to make something else, and they just don't want, you don't want to ruin their reputation when they start.
You don't want any libel.
The libel of it.
Or it doesn't matter whether they're in the industry or not, right? At the end of the day, I'm dealing with people who are still alive. Even if I'm usually there's a rule for traditional historians. I don't know if there's like a saying like this on your side of the pond, Gareth, but something has to be more than 35 years old before you can you're even allowed to think that you might do a history of it.
That sounds like what we're told. Yeah, 35, 30.
Yeah. And I just today put in for the first time a document into my database that had a date of 2001. I was like, that's how recently I'm having to kind of straddle a timeline because of how strange and long Sierra's history is. Definitely one of the most complicated parts of this for me, I think, is writing a history that that maintains the dignity of everyone I talk to. Mm-hmm. That's how I would frame it.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
You know,
because I mean, the reason why we can talk about Roberta Williams in this sense, and why is we can badmouth her and talk about her horrible design decisions, or we can talk about the legend.
You can do that, sir. You can do that.
I'm speaking in the general we, not the we. I mean, we're scholars and gentlemen all around. I mean, yeah, right, yeah, total libel alert there. But she's not really around much to defend herself, kind of. So the press and even unethical historians can pretty much write anything they want about her, because she is very reluctant to come out and go, no, actually, it was more like this. So not to sound all weird and cynical or anything, but it's kind of like she died and went away or something, and you can kind of you can take some. She's sort of
has elected to evaporate from the record, and
that's a good one.
And the way I think of that is like, some people ask me if I'm like bummed out about that, or that I've never tried to directly ask her if she would speak to me. I'm not ready to try to make that request.
That's a tough one too, yeah.
But if she doesn't want to, like for me, I think for a good historian, that's also part of the story, right? Like I actually don't see that as a loss. Mm-hmm. And maybe to wrap to something you were saying earlier, Trolls, about we certainly do have this fantasy, I think, that we could somehow save everything. And I think I find that to be like a really weird impulse. We have lost tons and tons and tons of our literature. We have lost tons of our early cinema. There's plenty of television, especially local, that you're never going to be able to get back or watch again, right? I can't experience a play in Shakespearean England. So why do I have this fantasy that like every single game that was ever made needs to be saved? They're not all going to get their own individual histories ever. There's simply not enough historians. And so I think once you start imagining like what is the role of any individual game on the arc of something like 50 or 100 years of this industry, I think for me, the significance does shift to stuff like I think actually the history of the development or the kind of internal organization of these companies is actually kind of more relevant than maybe any particular game that they made.
The culture, the climate, the video game market crashing left and right, resurgence, Kickstarter, all of that.
Yeah, I think that is a great place for us to call this an episode.
Absolutely agree.
Would you agree?
That was beautiful, actually.
Sure.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much, Laine. To those of you listening who would like to find out more, I get the feeling that it's my job to write the blog post this week, and there are going to be lots and lots of footnotes. Because
you absolutely you need to link Gareth to my piece on soft porn adventure that was in The Atlantic.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yes. I've read that one. The one where you went through all the photos of Roberta and the ladies in the hot tub, and the poor guy who had to stand in tepid water for most of the evening.
I was very lucky to have. I met the original photographer of that photo shoot. He still lives in Oakhurst. And I met him.
He is currently in a traumatized state.
And,
he's still in the hot tub.
I met him, thankfully, actually because I was going through microfilm. That was how I found his name, because they republished that ad in the local paper, because that ad had also been published in Time magazine. And so the fact that a number of local residents were in Time magazine became local news in Oakhurst.
Oh, wow.
So they republished, they printed the photo, and then with that photo, it is the only place in the record where they list the name of the guy who took it. And so I met him, and it was very funny.
Journalism.
He sent me I had spoken with him once, and then a year later I just went back and I sent him an email, and I was like, oh, can you verify, here's a quote I kind of remember from our conversation. Is it okay if I attribute this to you? He was like, oh yeah, by the way, I was cleaning out a drawer in my desk and I found these slides. Do you want them? And I was just like, holy God, yes, I want them. So he sent me, he mailed me the 4 only known outtakes of the soft porn photo shoot. And so I had to take them to a copy store and get them scanned, right? Because they were actually like 35 millimeter slides, and get like digital prints made of them so that I could use them. And then only 2 of them we printed in that piece, because the other 2 were a little. Both me and my editor kind of discussed them. We were like, yeah, we think there's like these women aren't really consenting to the use of this photo, and these are like there was just a little, I don't know, the water lines were a little more ambiguous.
There was a nipple. Let's just be honest. There was a nipple.
In 2 of the photos, so we decided not to like put them out for public consumption on the internet. Those
the sort of consumption you're talking about is not what you want in a serious article.
No.
Well, I just didn't want people making a bunch of stupid comments about them. Like that was actually what I didn't want, you know? Because
like the one I just did.
This is why we can't have nice things, trolls.
That's why you can't have nice things, absolutely. But so they will be going to the Strong Museum of Play, and sit in a box somewhere for some other historian to come and like make use of one day.
Like, you know, the big hall at the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark with all the boxes. you have the soft phone slide sitting somewhere next to the Ark of the Covenant.
Being looked after top men.
And there's a dude at the entrance going, so what's your Xbox Live user handle? Oh, it's so-and-so. Oh, you have an Xbox user live handle. Get the fuck out, please.
All that to say that, yes, all that's going into the blog post. So you can find that at backseatdesigners.com. And we'll probably tweet that out on @BSDesigners. You can also find us on Facebook if you search for Backseat Designers. We have a Coke fund for Fred. And to obviously he needs to keep his girlfriend in nice things. So you'll be able to...
via my voice, neither of which are doing me much good at the moment.
And I want to say that these guys deserve total credit for Skyping with me this late in their evenings.
Time zones.
When they otherwise could be cuddling with their girlfriends, as I understand it.
There's a bit of a distance, but I'm not averse to long train rides, but but I appreciate the sentiment enormously. Thank you.
I just like how that immediately conjured up an image of wife swapping in my head, and I just no, I'm not going to cuddle Garrett's wife. That's weird. She doesn't even know me.
Well, anyway, Danish trains are expensive, so go to Patreon, throw Fred a couple of bucks. It'll keep him happy.
Fred has a new travel fund.
Exactly, and it will keep us on the virtual air. Laine, if people want to get in contact with you, or is there anything you'd like to plug before we go?
You mentioned a book.
Oh God, yeah. The book will be out in like 5 years, guys. So give it a minute. It will be called "Before We Were Gamers" is the current title.
Nice.
Look for that book in about 5 years. You can follow my historical adventures best on Twitter, where I am Sierra_offline. Offline with no hyphen, just one word. Sierra_offline. You can Google my name, super easy to find. I tend to keep my most recent exciting interviews and writings up on the front page of that. So you can follow me that way as well. Yeah.
Absolutely brilliant. So, thank you very much, Laine. Please say goodbye, trolls.
Goodbye.
And say goodbye, Fred.
Goodbye.
And we will see you next week.
Bye-bye.
No more for today.